Welcome to the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy, where Sunday's sermon sparks Wednesday's conversation. Each week, they sit down to dive deeper, reflect thoughtfully, and wrestle with the themes of this week's message. Their goal is to explore faith more fully, ask the hard questions, and invite you into a dialogue that goes beyond the pulpit.
Welcome into the podcast, everyone. I'm Pastor Randy Moore.
And I'm Pastor Andy Payton.
And we sit down for the first time today.
This is true.
They say you're not supposed to sit all that much. We haven't been doing all that much.
I'm not going to complain if I get to sit for a little bit at this point. It's been a busy day. It's been a good day, but it just, the life of a pastor, it's this thing to this thing to this thing.
Right.
And I enjoy days like this because there's never a dull moment, but my head gets to spinning by the end of the day.
All right. Well, you take a deep breath, and we'll take a deep breath, and we'll get started. It's August, and we're in a sermon series here in the month of August, and we call it The Next Faithful Step. Talk a little bit about, as we get started, your idea behind this sermon series and what it is that you wanted to do with it, accomplish with it.
Well, I built the series out of the lectionary. Mm-hmm. And specifically the Hebrew Bible passages, the Old Testament passages that are assigned for these particular Sundays. And so I took a look ended up obviously with the Old Testament passages here, and I took a look, it's the story of Joseph, and then we're getting into Exodus. And so I thought, what could we do with that? That's practical. I felt like as I looked at some of my previous sermons and some of our previous sermon series, we were a little more theological, doctrinal with the things we had talked about. Like, for example, in the month of June, we really dealt with the Wesleyan way of salvation. So we were talking theology throughout June. And in August, what I was wanting to do, really, as we move towards the fall, is just think about what are some practical things we can do when it comes to living out our faith, and what can these old ancient stories have to teach us in terms of just practical ways to live things out. So
and there were lots of steps in the early the life of God's people. Of course, even Jesus, and it took a while for this to sink in with me, but in Luke, which we're studying in my Zoom study this at this time, Jesus in the Gospel of Luke travels for 10 chapters to get from Galilee to Jerusalem. So there's something about being on the road. There's something about taking that step. Of course, there is the Exodus. That's a lot of steps. And even with the patriarchs, there's movement. So there's something about movement, and there's life. A destination, but we don't know what the destination, or exactly how it's going to go, or what we want to find at the destination. And a lot of it comes along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it comes from trusting that you're not alone, that God is with you, that we are on a journey that's not necessarily of our own creation. If nothing else, that's what Genesis and Exodus kind of come together to do, is to teach us that, when we're in these uncertain times, when we find ourselves in an uncertain moment, the image I've used some in this sermon series has been this pit. We're in a pit where our dream that we had collapses down. The next faithful step, essentially, sometimes, maybe it's all the time, just is to trust and to trust that God is with us in the midst of that moment we find ourselves in. I found myself really loving the story of Joseph this time, though, Randy. Admittedly, that's not a person I focus much on in terms of my preaching. But like you said Sunday, his story encompasses like 13 chapters of the book of Genesis. So there's 50 chapters in Genesis. 13 of those chapters is just Joseph. Yeah. And as you look into Exodus, it's not, I guess I just missed it, but Joseph continues to be a pivotal figure for the story of Exodus, even to the point when, I never noticed this before, maybe you have, where when the Israelites end up leaving Egypt, and they're going towards the promised land, they take the bones of Joseph with them, which, I mean, is rich in terms of the symbolism of what that means. And so, if nothing else, I think these old stories have a lot to teach us about how do we journey in an uncertain time? How do we journey in an uncertain world? What does it mean to live faithfully when we don't have the future all figured out? Yeah. That's this.
And the next faithful step, because sometimes all we can do is take that one step.
Right.
because it's a leap of faith. It's a step of faith. But we want things to be planned out better than that, don't we? So that's what makes it hard.
Oh yeah, I mean, we want control, and faith is not about control.
Yeah,
not to rain on anybody's parade, but that's just the way it is. Like we surrender.
Yeah,
surrender to God, basically. Yeah.
Well, you've already alluded to this, but we really should pay attention to Joseph, because his story gets a lot of treatment in that transition from Genesis to Exodus. It's from 37 to 50. There's not a story, I don't believe, that comes even close to that length. That has to be important in and of itself.
Right.
That he's an important character. Now, could you do this? And because it's 13 chapters, we can't very quickly summarize it, but just as briefly as you can, the story of Joseph.
Well, in terms of our lives, what Joseph gives us is a lens for our spiritual formation. And don't read Joseph's story simply as a historical narrative. Read Joseph's story in some ways similar to what we would do with the Gospels, that this is the journey that God is inviting us to take to. And that's the first thing I would say about Joseph. So he starts out being the annoying sibling. He's a tattletale. He gets, of course, his coat. He gets treated differently than all the rest. And his dream is everyone's going to bow down to him. So Joseph's story begins in many ways like all of us, in the sense that when we're younger, we have a lot to learn. And ultimately, his dreams come crashing down. And it's in that moment where he gets thrown into the pit by his siblings that really, even though God's not mentioned in that moment, that's God's classroom for Joseph. And it's similar to us. Again, we go through our lives, we have everything planned out. Like Joseph, we have big dreams. And then what happens? Well, life never goes as planned. We get thrown into the pit. And it's in that pit of suffering that ultimately God does some of God's biggest work. And that's certainly true for Joseph. As he emerges from the pit, he is sold into slavery. And it's really the best thing that ever happens to him. Joseph begins to have to use his administrative skills to help the Egyptian people. He exhibits profound integrity in the way he lives and interacts with the Egyptian people. He gains wisdom in the way he interprets the dreams God gives him. Instead of the dreams he's given as confirmation of his greatness, which is young Joseph, the dreams that God gives Joseph as he gets older is that they're really about, God's dreams are really about how do I live my life in such a way to preserve the lives of many people. And so ultimately, of course, then Joseph the big moment is when he forgives his siblings, the very ones that have betrayed him. He forgives the people that have hurt him deeply. This is all a journey that God is inviting us all to take. In a sense, if I could just use a phrase, it would be grow up. God is saying it's time for us to grow up and quit playing the young Joseph game, but to move towards the older Joseph figure who becomes a preserver of life for his siblings, a preserver of life for the Egyptian people, who, by the way, would be the enemy in many ways. But that's who God calls us to be.
Well, in a word, grace.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the word's not mentioned in Joseph's story, but that's the name of Joseph's story, is the grace of God moving him towards the sanctified life, what we would use, that's the language we'd use as Methodist.
And Jesus' name, of course, isn't mentioned, but I think as Christians, we're always looking at the Old Testament for what it has to say about Jesus. And we want to quickly say that those who practice Judaism and those whose Bible is what we call the Old Testament, that their faith is sufficient. But as Christians, then, and I think this would be helpful if we talk about this a little bit to our listeners and our viewers. But this doesn't mean that that there's not something for us, and that it's okay to look for Jesus or to look for pointers to Jesus in the Old Testament. Amy Jill Levine even said that. I was glad she did, because Amy Jill Levine is a Jew who teaches New Testament. And she says, as Jews, we don't read the Old Testament thinking about Jesus, but Christians do, and they should. So in here, you get falling and rising, falling and rising, falling and rising.
Yeah, which is the pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah. The pattern of God's work in our lives. There's endings and new beginnings. There's endings and new beginnings. I end this job, there's another one. Mm-hmm. I lose this loved one, and over time I grieve, and life begins again in a new way. It's the pattern of how God works, for sure.
Yeah, you fall in one pit, you climb out of that pit, or you get some help out of that pit, but then that's not the end of the pit.
Well, there's a heresy where, there was an early church a group of people in the early church who they wanted to completely get away from the Old Testament and just get rid of it. And that became, they called that a heresy, in the sense that, well, no, the God that you read about in the Hebrew Bible comes to us in Jesus. That's the Christian mindset. They're kind of the one and same God, Mm-hmm. I mean, although I would say, admittedly, there are some moments in the Hebrew Bible where it's harder to see Christ than in others. I mean, but Christ is definitely there. If you look at the big picture, like Joseph's story, for example, over the course of 13 chapters, you can see this movement of grace that God is moving Joseph in a similar way to what God is wanting to do in our lives today.
Yeah. Let's just read a clip of it, because I'm sure you've read it, listeners and viewers, or you've heard it read. But there is a lot there, and more than we could do justice to during a worship reading. But let's read the 5 verses that you had read as your text. This comes from from chapter 45 in the first 5 verses. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." I mean, just right down on the ground without any further study. I mean, this is so powerful. He sends everybody away, sends everybody out of the room, because this is a family matter that needs to be worked out. And family in the Bible is code for, for us, the church or the people. And so I found that to be powerful. Here he is, he's second in command, in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And here come these brothers, and it's like, I've got some big news to share with you all. Mm-hmm. But then also, it must have been the crying, the emotion, that everybody noticed it, even the Pharaoh. And he asks them to come closer. And wow, this is a powerful scene. It's a pivot. It's a pivotal moment in this in the narrative, for sure. I do find it interesting the brothers never say anything. I know. They couldn't even talk. Uh-huh. They were struck dumb, essentially. I mean, they were just afraid too, I think, probably. Afraid too, and ready for expecting punishment. Yeah. And that's what I focused on with my sermon. What's the next faithful step? Well, I took the angle of the brothers, which is, you never hear, they don't get talked about very much. It's all Joseph, right? Mm-hmm. What about the brothers? And the theme for the sermon this particular last Sunday was this idea of facing our shadow, mm-hmm. where we have these hidden motivations within our lives, where in this case, Joseph says to the brothers, "I forgive you." Brothers are not convinced it's true. Mm-hmm. And that happens to us in so many ways as well. Even to this day, you can tell yourself one thing in the head, but your heart's going to tell you something else. And that friction, I think, becomes a real problem for Christian spiritual formation even to this day. It happens again and again where you might have this high moment with God, and then a couple days later, a couple weeks later, like, where did it go? Why am I feeling this way? Well, those old patterns that are kind of hidden within our heart, what in Christian spirituality, Randy, we call the shadow, they re-manifest themselves over and over again. That is so true. Just today, I had a conversation with someone, and I won't say who it was or what exactly we were meeting for, but at-risk children was part of what we talked about. And she was talking about the fact that, in general, not in every case, at-risk kids have these scripts, and you talked about the scripts that run in our minds and in our lives. They have these scripts in their minds and they have been etched in their minds for so long and so deeply that to tell them one time that they're worthy might not be enough, because that script that's running in their head is telling them that they are not worthy all the time.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that motivates them. It
Yes.
shapes them.
Yeah.
It shapes the way they experience people. It shapes the way they experience reality. And that's not isolated to just at-risk youth or people who've gone through trauma. As a young person who've gone through trauma. It's all of us. We've all been shaped in this way. And really, when a person gets to that point where they're going to say, I'm going to take the spiritual journey seriously, when we get to that place, then it means that we start to become aware of these scripts that operate in our lives, and we begin to go through the process of, I'm not saying we can always mute them. I'm not saying they always just go away, but I can say I think we can grow in our capacity not to trust them as much as we used to. And if a person isn't trying to become aware of these inner scripts, though, then we're just doomed to repeat the same old patterns year after year, week after week, again and again. And that's what happens with us when it comes to the Christian life. Consciously, we can say, I want to follow Jesus. Subconsciously, we have all these other scripts going on underneath the surface of our lives where the heart's like, yeah, right, I'm going to go follow this, or I'm going to follow that. I'm going to go in all these different directions. And a lot of times what happens, I think, over time is people just says, well, they just say to themselves, there's no use. Yeah. I'm going to give up and just walk away. We haven't done enough work on this topic of shadow.
Well, and you actually used John Wesley as one of your examples, and you let the cat out of the bag that we pastors typically don't tell the rest of the story, but most Methodists know about Wesley's Aldersgate experience. I was a member at Aldersgate United Methodist Church in Evansville, and so Methodists know that story. What they don't all know, but most of us who are pastors, we know it because we've had to learn it, that wasn't the end. He didn't reach the summit at Aldersgate.
He mentions Aldersgate, I think, one time in his journal.
Yeah.
It's the May 24th, 1738 entry,
right,
where he talks about his heart being strangely warmed. That's the only time John Wesley talks about that. What he talks about after that, though, is he talks about his doubt. He talks about his joys. He talks about, really 4 days later, there's an entry where he says, if I really believe, then why isn't there more of a change in my life? And I'm like, if anyone has ever felt like that, I want them to know you're not alone, because we've all felt like that.
Well, maybe we don't tell the rest of the story because we're afraid that maybe people can't handle it. We like the idea of reaching the summit and of getting there spiritually and staying there and there never being another problem. But we know by experience,
that's not it.
If we're going to be honest with our people, they'll know, we've all had, I shouldn't say all, but most of us have had some sort of a spiritual high somewhere along the way. But, I think the mountain valley metaphor is a pretty good one. We've all had mountaintop experiences, but most of life is lived in the valley. Yeah. Yeah.
Or a combination, a little bit of both.
Yeah. Yeah.
I might be in the mountaintop in this area of my life and the valley in this other. It's a mix. And so building on all this conversation around shadow, then I used the story of Joseph and his family as a lens, if you will, to teach us how we might confront that shadow part of our lives. And again, what I mean by shadow are these hidden motivations that usually go unnoticed. If we're not careful and we don't become aware of them, we just become like, again, that broken record where we keep doing the same old thing. And the first thing I suggested.
Hold on just a second. You had this as a slide, and so
you're going to use my definition?
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm not, because I couldn't write it all down. So you're going to finish it. Okay. All right. So the shadow is the accumulation of untamed emotions, less than pure motives, and thoughts that largely unconscious and read out of sight.
Determine our behavior.
Okay. Yep. Yeah.
These are the little triggers that live underneath the surface of our lives that get set off by people in the present. But really what happens is all this stuff that's there from the past gets triggered too, and we end up overreacting to that person within our lives. to turn to the gospel for a moment, I wrestled with this in my sermon. I think in some ways what we're talking about here, maybe you see this in the Gospels when we talk about demons.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Which, interesting, in the mainline church, you never hear talk about demons because we don't know what to do with it.
Right.
Regardless of what a person actually thinks about demons and Satan and all that, I think really there are some interesting points to be made from the Gospels when Jesus confronts the demoniacs and the demons within his ministry. And one of the first things he always says to the demons is, "What is your name?"
Yeah.
And okay, let's just stop right there.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing we can do when we're talking about our shadow. We're having a less than pure motive. We're having untamed emotion. We're having this experience. The first step to really getting our hands around it, if you will, is to name whatever it is we're feeling. Mm-hmm. And the phrase I used in the sermon was, in order to tame these emotions, we have to name the emotions, sort of like Jesus names the demons in the Gospels. And of course, Joseph's family becomes a case study on what happens when we don't do that. Things begin to build in the brothers' lives until early on in Joseph's story, they decide first they're going to kill him, but next they throw him in the pit. And that's what happens to us as humanity even to this day. We don't name what we're feeling. We don't name what we're experiencing. It builds until finally it blows. And so that first step to name to the shadow work is to name what we're experiencing. The second step would be the issue is not the issue, though. Much of the time, whatever it is that you are projecting onto that person in front of us, all the things that we're thinking about that person issue is not always the issue.
Right.
But yet they end up having to carry it because we're not aware that we're putting all that upon them. Mm-hmm. Again, go back to Joseph and his family. I pointed out in my sermon the issue with the brothers. It really wasn't Joseph. The real issue was that Jacob, the father, had treated Joseph with favoritism. And all that rage ends up getting placed upon Joseph in the story. Mm-hmm. And the brothers, they really don't take any responsibility for any of it really until way down the road. They finally go to Joseph towards the end of Genesis and say, it's after Jacob dies, they finally confront it. Yeah. But, yeah. So, I mean, some of the hidden motives we have in our lives can come from, we might have grown up in a home where our parent was a perfectionist and an A- wasn't good enough. Mm-hmm. And the moment someone criticizes us now, everything comes crumbling down for us. Mm-hmm. It might have just been constructive criticism, but it doesn't feel like that because we have this inner voice, this inner script going. Another one could be, we grew up in a chaotic home, a broken type of home situation. And we find that when we can't control everything now, we become angry or maybe really anxious. Again, that's the inner script type of stuff that's happening within our lives. Or what was the other one I talked about in the examples I gave?
God couldn't possibly forgive me.
God couldn't possibly forgive me. Yeah, we've been conditioned with a certain understanding of God where our head tells us one thing, but our heart tells us something different. And so really a lot of the inner work of the spiritual journey begins to become to name whatever it is we're feeling and then realize whatever it is we're feeling, a lot of times the issue is not the issue. We need to begin to deal with. Much of the shadow comes from our family system. That's the story of Joseph. It's about a family system. Mm-hmm. Like you said, this is family business now. Yeah. Exactly. It is.
Yeah.
But until we become aware of it, we're doomed to just kind of live by same old software.
Yeah, and the church could learn a thing or two if they would just dwell on this story, because I think that we tend to think of church as being like the happiest place on earth, and everybody comes to church, and everybody's smiling, and everybody's happy, which is all well and good. But if we could, as communities of faith, be this vulnerable with each other, this is where the real transformation is possible.
Some of the spiritual teachers, like Thomas Keating, Richard Rohr, John Wesley, would say, unless your prayer life invades your subconscious, unless one's prayer life invades the shadow, no real transformation is going to happen long term. Mm-hmm. That's a bold statement, but I have to wonder if it's kind of true. I've watched it happen where someone shows up to worship. They're on fire. They love the place. 6 weeks later, where'd they go? Well, the old stuff just comes right back up, and like, well, we're going to keep on going the same old direction we were going beforehand. And so the key then becomes to find some practices to help invade these kinds of spaces within our lives. And that's what I did not get into in my sermon because I honestly ran out of time.
Right.
But the first biggie when invading the subconscious and confronting our shadow is silent prayer.
Oh, yeah.
No one likes the silence, at first at least, because here's the thing that happens when we become silent before God.
Those scripts get really loud.
You have to hear yourself,
Yeah.
And the same old stuff keeps popping up in the silence. And that's why spiritual teachers will say in silent prayer, one of the things you can do in that moment is name whatever it is that's coming up. And then once you name it, you can learn to let it go. What might be your to-do list.
Mm-hmm.
It might be thinking through what you're going to say to that person that made you mad the day before.
Right.
It's just endless. It just starts coming up. One of the things that the contemplative prayer teachers will say is you become present to the presence of God in silence. And then as these things come up, think of these as God introducing the subject of your conversation for today. And today's subject of conversation in the silence, a lot of times, is the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're naming these things and you're learning to let them go. And by golly, what happens as you become more versed in this is through your day-to-day life, you're able to be present to the presence of God in day-to-day living. And when the shadow begins to manifest, you can say, oh, there's anger. Let it go. There's resentment. Let it go. Jealousy. Let it go. And like a river, you can let it, like a boat, pass. And
contemplative prayer is kind of a niche interest in the church. I'm not trying to be critical, but for the very reasons we've been talking about, it's in the beginning and maybe always to some level, it's hard because
Mm-hmm.
you are alone. If you're silent, you just really can't fill it up with music or conversation or anything else. And so people get rather uncomfortable with it.
Oh, and there's all kinds of things that people have said to me over the years when I've tried to teach contemplative prayers, like, well, the devil's going to get me if I just become an empty space. I'm like, well, I don't know. Maybe the devil's already got you.
Right.
What the voice has.
Yeah.
If you're not going to confront it.
Yeah.
That's probably an overstatement. But the big one is silence, though. Jesus is the model here. He spends nights in prayer. He goes, he hears the Spirit in his baptism. Where does he go next? Into the wilderness. What's he do there? He confronts the devil. Mm-hmm. This is what we're invited to do as well as a people of faith. So silence is a big one. The other one I wanted to talk about in my sermon was journaling.
Mm-hmm.
John Wesley, back to him, journaled all the time. And really what he journaled about was just what was happening within his life, but also Wesley and folks within the Christian tradition that recommend journaling, they will talk about you begin to write about the inner experience of your day-to-day life, your emotional reaction. And then it creates a space where you can think through, where is this really coming from? Mm-hmm. Is it coming from this conscious part of me, or why is it underneath the surface? These things are happening within our lives. And this is where the real work begins in terms of our motives. One of the quick ways that I would suggest thinking through a person's motives is whatever it is you're getting ready to do, who's it really for?
It's for me.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a hard one to ask. Yeah. Even the good things that we as pastors do can be done with selfish motives. Am I doing this just to save face? Mm-hmm. Am I doing just to win a person over? Or is my real motive just to contribute to the life of another? Facing the shadow really is about coming to terms with what's my real motive here. And understanding your real motive is the process by which we protect ourselves from truly burning out. Because in the ministry field, we can get doing a lot of really good things for a lot of wrong reasons. And then if we keep doing a lot of those really good things for a lot of those really wrong reasons, we just burn out and fizzle away, because it really wasn't the will of God that we did all that stuff. We were just doing it for ourselves the whole time. It's subtle, but it's sinful in the sense it's pointed inward.
I think the church is aware of it, but dealing with it is another thing. I mentioned this here before, and we talk about doing this soul check-in, but that's what our process of examination as pastors involves, is trying to get an idea whether you're burning out or not, because they're aware of burnout because they've seen burnout so much. And so the church acknowledges it, has ways of dealing with it, but it's a big effort to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, well, what the church has traditionally done when we are not getting the results that we're looking for, what we've traditionally done is we try to do what we did before, but more of it.
Yeah.
So we need more people in church. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to worship harder. We need more people to love Jesus. So what we're going to do? We're going to have multiple Bible studies. We need just more and more of what we've already done that hasn't worked necessarily before, but yet we think it's going to work now. And what I'm trying to point us to is this idea of the thing that's gone missing is this inner work of facing the shadow, learning about our inner motives, and then creating space to allow God to begin to transform that within our lives. That's where we move from just having an impact on the world to, and again, impact's not bad, but actual transformation happens when we begin to allow God to actually transform us.
It's a heart change.
Yeah. Essentially. Absolutely. So.
All right. That next faithful step this week.
Well, we're into Exodus now.
Love Exodus.
And, it's good. It's the birth of Moses.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about how if you're going to understand Exodus, you have to also understand the book of Genesis. It's one and the same God. But the thing I'll leave us with today is that I learned, and I never noticed this before, I mentioned earlier, is that when they end up leaving Egypt, they carry the bones of Joseph with them. And so what's the next faithful step for us? We have to learn to carry the bones of Joseph with us as well. And that becomes a mark of a promise that we live our lives by.
Nice. We'll look forward to that. Pastor Randy, thanks a lot. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We really do appreciate it. We pray that you have a great week, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you for listening to the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. We hope you'll join us next week. We see Christ in you.